Life Audio.
Welcome to the Untangling Prayer podcast. I'm Rachel Wojo, and each week we unravel life's knots through prayer. Here you'll find practical wisdom and prayer encouragement to guide you through life's hardest seasons. Join me as we untangle life's messes together, one prayer at a time. Well, hey friends, welcome to the Untangling Prayer podcast. I'm Rachel Wojo, and I want to thank you for being here today. I'm so excited for the new year of podcasting. I took a little break over the holiday. I doubt if most of you even noticed, but I did take Christmas and New Year's off because those were both Wednesdays, our normal release day, and I figured you were busy with your families. May the Lord bless you as you listen to today's episode. I think it's going to be a fantastic one. I know it's going to be a fantastic one because Lissa has so much to share with us on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. One of the biggest reasons I hear people say they don't pray is because they don't have time or they can't figure out how to make the time. And I'm a huge proponent that it doesn't have to be perfect, but I am also a student of time and how we spend it. And Lissa has such a great heart for this topic, so I can't wait for you to hear what she has to say. Thanks for being here today. I'm so excited to share with you a new guest for me. I just met Lissa recently, and so recently, in fact, it was today. But I heard about her wonderful website and her incredible podcast, Redeem Her Time, and I couldn't wait to have her as a guest because I know she has so much value to give us. Lissa, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, Rachel, this is going to be a great time spent together. So thank you for the invitation. And I'm looking forward to you being on the Redeem Her Time podcast as well.
It is incredible that you are so organized, so meticulous. I love that you're easy to understand. And I think I like all of that much because you talk about how so many women feel scattered in their lives. And I've felt that pain. Not every day, all the time, but I have felt that pain. And so I wanted you to just first address what are some of the first signs that someone might be living that way, like living every day where they feel scattered, and how can they begin to just make a shift toward a more focused life?
Yes. Well, I wish I could say that I had this all figured out from day one, and I did it the way I'm doing it now. Still not perfectly, still, as growing through this. So maybe sharing my story will help some people to resonate with those signs that I ignored because I was the poster child for busy, right? I had all the things going on. My husband was in the military, so I was a military wife. He would be gone for up to a year at a time. We have 3 children, so often I would be, on this side of the pond, we call it, not only taking care of 3 kids by myself, but also homeschooling them. I was running women's ministry at our church. I was very active in our community and neighborhood. I was, being the friend. I was, being the daughter, being the sister, all of the things. And I was running ragged. I think for me, it was this, my brain never stopped. And I never allowed myself to stop, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe someone listening is thinking, yes, if my body stops, my brain is still always going, right? And so I was always multitasking. I was always trying to cram things into the nooks and crannies of my day. I was, getting up super early, staying up later than I should. And, there were a couple of signs that I experienced, but I ignored. The first one was some of the physical signs. So I would often have this knot in my stomach. It's just this tenseness, this tightness in my chest. My shoulders always felt like they were either hunched or clenched together, clenching my teeth at night, so I was grinding my teeth. So I had a lot of different things that were going on in my body, but who has time to slow down and think about those things when you have all these people and things that are calling for your attention, right? I also had this guilt in my head that I wasn't being the wife that I should be, the daughter that I should be, the mom that I should be, the business owner, like all these different things. But again, I'm just, okay, so I just have to do more and I have to do better and I just have to get better at managing my time. That was, so I pushed past, all these things. And I was the mom. I almost hate to admit this. I would bring my own screen to family movie night. Have you been there, right? Like, oh, we're watching a movie and here shows up mom with her laptop because she still has emails to write or she still has content to create or she still has, I couldn't put down all the doing to just be. And so what eventually got my attention was I started to feel a ball in my throat. And I noticed it. And of course, I ignored it at first. And then I noticed it was still there. So I thought, maybe I need to slow down my eating. Maybe I need to drink more water. Like, let's figure this out. When it got to over a year, I thought, oh no, maybe something's growing and I need to go get this checked out. So I promised my besties I would go to a doctor. I did. He tried medication. He tried diet changes. He even scoped my throat. He sat me down in his office and he looked at me and he said, Lissa, there is no ball in your throat. I've put a camera down there. He said, there's no physical reason that you should be feeling this there. And he looked at me and he said, you have hystericus globus. And he just had this smirk on his face. And I'm like, what is hystericus globus? He said, globus, ball, like a globe, right? You have this feeling of a ball. And hystericus, and he starts swirling his finger next to his head, like meaning crazy. He said, that's where they get the word hysterectomy from because they thought women were going crazy in that season of their life. He's like, this is all in your head, and I'm happy to prescribe you a pill. Now, I'm not against people taking medication, but I knew in that moment that a pill was not going to fix the problem because my busyness, so essentially what it was is my anxiety around time. I was always behind. I never felt like I was doing enough. Then it led to I was not enough. And it was just this constant chase, right?
Yeah.
And so I knew a pill wasn't going to fix the head and the heart problem. It might fix some of the physical symptoms, right? And so that's really when God got my attention and started saying, Lissa, like slow down, start trusting me with your time. And, that's when things started shifting around how I approach time and, then learning how to have this healthy relationship with time and a healthy perspective of it, which is so all that to say, there may be physical signs that someone's experiencing. It may be the mental, like my head is always going and rushing and on to the next thing. I would be present in body, but my mind was always somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right. So some of those thoughts, those feelings, if you're saying things to yourself, like, I don't have time, there's never enough time. If I have time, I'll have time when the kids go to school, right? They move out of the house and it's not true, right? So we need to pay attention to what our body's saying and what our mind is saying and notice and then take some of those next steps, which was what we'll talk about.
Yeah. I can totally resonate with what you're saying. And I just believe that our productivity often is a gauge of our worth as women. We think that productivity is a gauge of our worth. And so stepping back and looking at what God has to say about how we spend our time is so important. So many of us, I think, when it comes to spending time with God, we skip it because we have this demand on our lives. And so even last night at my small group, someone was saying it's really hard to find the time to pray and be focused on that. And so how can we really prioritize our spiritual time without feeling like we're neglecting everything else? And especially when you're a caregiver, whether it is small children that you're caring for or teenagers or your aging parents, there are all kinds of ways that we feel like the caregiving that we do and the roles that we have really supersede finding that spiritual time with the Lord. So I know this is an important topic to you. Would you just share with us some of the secrets that you found in this area?
Yes. Okay. A couple things coming to my mind. The first thing is I think we have to understand we do have time. We make time for what things matter to us. I was actually just this morning in my quiet time with the Lord, making that time a priority, even though I had, all kinds of things to prepare for today. I was listening to the song Divided Heart by Davy Flowers, and it's talking about how our hearts are so prone to wander and to chase after all of these lesser things. And so the truth is, we do have time and we can make time for what matters. But the enemy wants us to believe we don't have time. I don't have time to spend with the Lord because I have all these other things I need to do. And so the first place that I always point women is to what they're telling themselves about their time, right? Because if you believe you don't have time, you're going to act like you don't have time. But if you want to know the truth, right, this is a scary thing. Grab your phone, open up the settings and open up screen time and look at how much time you gave to this thing in the last 24 hours. The average person spends 4 hours and 37 minutes a day on their phone. And that's average, which means some people are twice that. If you do the math times 365, that is 70 days a year. 2.5 months of 24-hour cycles went to something like this, right? So we do have time. So then it comes down to the priority of it, which is the second part that I want to look at, right? Like, just like our phone, at some point in the day, this thing has to be plugged into a charger, or it's not going to have the charge it needs to do what you need it to do. And I think so often, especially some of the examples you gave of being a caretaker, whether it's for young children or aging parents, or even just of ourselves in the ministries or the business or the homes that we're called to steward right now, if we are always going, if we're always pouring out, we will literally, be the battery that dies. Yeah. And so one of the things that I teach inside of the way that I teach women to look at their time, it's that we need times in our day to refill. I call them the refills and the pour outs. We have to have time to refill, right? Because if we are not filled, body, mind, and spirit, we can't pour out. And I think herein comes that guilt factor that so many moms, or, as we're dealing with aging parents, we feel guilty if we're not always doing for them. And yet, if we are not filled up in body, mind, and spirit, we're only giving them just drops, right? Yeah. And so really, I think that's the selfish thing, is to not be taking the time to fill up so that we can fully pour out. So it's really understanding this is essential. I have to be recharged. I have to fill up, whatever analogy you want to use, in order to pour out in the way that God has called me to. Right. And yes, it may be more of a challenge, especially if you have little ones who are waking up the same time you do, and you don't want to get up at dark 100 to beat them, out of bed, but it can just be a couple of minutes. Yeah. And God multiplies our time, right? We think it has to be an hour or it has to be 30 minutes. What if it was 5 minutes? Or even 2 minutes? God can use that time, right? Because there's a purpose behind it.
So good. I want to go back to something that you brought up, and that is the phone, because I think that it's so important to say no to the distractions. And I think that's some of what you were talking about with that. And so can you share some practical advice on how to confidently set boundaries with your phone, with your schedule, with your people, without feeling guilty? Because so many of us think we just have to be in all the places all the time, and we make ourselves so accessible. I read a book years ago when Lisa Turkhurst wrote the book, The Best Yes, and it was one of the best yeses that I ever made in reading that book. So I would love for you to, I know this is a major problem for so many women. Share with me your best practical tips on saying no to the distractions without feeling that guilt.
Yes. Okay. I love that, because literally my CEOs, I call my clients Christ empowered operators of the life and business that God has given them. We're reading The Best Yes right now as we speak.
I didn't know that. That's such awesome. A good book. I love that book.
Okay, so I think the first thing is looking at what are boundaries, because I think so often we think boundaries are selfish, boundaries are bad, boundaries are pushing people away. So let's imagine you want to grow some vegetables, right? And so you would not just go out and throw some vegetable seeds in your yard and hope that vegetables pop up. You would go and prepare, a little area of land, right? You would clear out the weeds. And if you live in an area like most of us, you would put up some kind of a fence around it, because otherwise all the critters are going to come and nibble at what things are starting to grow, right? And so that fence is to protect what's inside so that it will produce the fruit so that that now can feed your family, right? So no one would pull up to your house and go, oh my goodness, look how selfish she is that she put a boundary around her garden and she's not letting the rabbits eat it. You would say, of course, because what's inside matters. And I think we have the
Yeah.
wrong focus on boundaries. We're so focused on all what's it doing to the outside, but really it's protecting what's inside. And so I
Yeah.
think we have to shift our perspective. Boundaries are me making space for what matters so that it can grow and flourish inside, right? So I think that's the first thing. And
Yeah.
there, if I'm not putting a boundary, I'm essentially saying to whatever is inside, you don't matter to me. Right.
Oh.
So therein is, okay, why am I feeling guilt around protecting my family time or protecting my marriage or protecting, my health or whatever those things are. So I think
Yeah.
there's that perspective shift there. The second thing that I would say is it's really important, and this is something I teach women, and it feels like such a little difference, but we run around saying, what time is it? And then, like you said, we're everywhere because we're like, oh, I need to be here and I need to do this and I need to do that. We think we should be everywhere, which is what you talked about, but we're really end up being nowhere because we're
Yeah.
spread so thin,
Mm.
right? So here's the
Yeah.
question I teach women to ask, and guys can ask this too. What is it time for? Now I'm putting some kind of a healthy boundary around that time in front of me. Number one, it presupposes I do have time. And number two, it presupposes there's a purpose for the time in front of me.
Yes.
And so then when I know what it's time for, right? So if it's time for me to fill up with the Lord, guess what? I'm not scrolling Facebook and I'm not
Right.
answering emails and I'm not switching the laundry and I'm not, now if my husband comes out and he has a question, of course, I will have that conversation, right? That's an okay distraction. But when I know what it's time for, now I'm intentionally putting those other things off for that time. And then I do
Yeah.
have time in my day when I do go and check my inboxes or when I do go and do those things.
Right.
So that can be a really simple tool to use. What is it?
Mhm. For sure. I often tell the groups that I lead for writers, speakers, and leaders, I often share with them one of the best things I learned from my friend Jill Savage. Jill taught me that before you wake up in the morning, the night before is when you prepare, and I give the example usually of when my children were small, I didn't want them to get up after they could dress themselves and put on striped pants with a polka dotted shirt. So what did we do? We wanted to teach them to dress themselves and to prepare. But in order to do that, then the night before they would choose their clothing, it would be before we say prayers, what are you wearing tomorrow? Do you know what you're wearing tomorrow? Let's lay it out now so that in the morning, that decision didn't have to be made. I didn't have to ask them to go back and change their clothes. It was proactively preparing them for that morning routine. And I believe that's the way we need to live our lives the night before. We need to look over our calendar. Even if we've prepared a month before, a week before, we need to look over. Especially, I found this to be true in a book launch season, especially that I need to understand, okay, here's the order of the agenda for tomorrow and prepare myself mentally to walk through the steps. So I think just by what you've just shared has prompted me to remember that looking at the night before, you ask that question, what is it time for? That allows us to be so much more proactive and have the feeling of contentment, fulfillment, satisfaction that we've walked through our calling, what God has on our lives, because we have proactively chosen to do those things. And when they're completed, we can check them off the list, feel good about it, and move on to the next thing with the idea that I'm walking in God's plan. I know what is next. And those distractions are eliminated that way. I love that example so much of the garden. It's really valuable. And when I'm looking at balancing, I've talked about launching a book, there are seasons where I'm sure you will admit that you cannot control everything. There are extenuating circumstances, interruptions. You just mentioned your husband walks in. That's not an interruption. That's just life. That's part of
Yes.
living with other people in community, right? But I guess I have to bring up the question of balance because I'm always interested in knowing how other people approach this idea of balancing life and business or life and ministry or life and family. And so how do you help women create balance in their lives, both professionally and personally?
I love this question because I think it comes down to understanding what balance is. I think we
Yes.
think that balance is a noun. It's this state of everything being equal, right? And everything being like where one side is exactly equal to the other and it's steady. And while that is in one sense what balance is, I really think that balance, especially in life, is more of a verb. So I want you to picture a ballerina, right? That ballerina who's up on her point shoes, right? And she is balancing. And if you're just looking at her from the waist up, it looks like she's got that exact spot picked out and she is right there. But if you look at her toes, what is she doing? She is making tiny adjustments to keep herself balanced. She's paying attention to which direction her body's starting to go, and she's making that adjustment. It is an ongoing act. She is not just reaching one place and then holding it. And I think this is really what balance is for us, especially like you talked about, we have different roles and responsibilities. We have different seasons in our life, in our business, in our relationships, in our ministries. And so there are times when something needs a little bit more attention than something else. But here's the thing. So I one of the things I teach, and this will be part of the planner that I have coming out, are 8 areas of our life that I believe we need to pay attention to. Our faith walk, our family, our friendships, our work, service, business, ministry, stewardship of finances, our wellness, our passions. Yes, you should have time for fun, and our homes. And so what I help women do is assess, how are these areas doing right now? And it is not, you took 24 hours in a day and divided by 8, that each area gets 3 hours a day. That actually would be unbalanced, right? Sleeping 3 hours a day would actually not work well, right? But paying attention to which areas are needing a little bit more of my time and attention, because there are those ebbs and flows. And, so paying attention to that, that's what helps us to maintain that sense of balance. Because here's what happens. If we don't pay attention to those areas and what they need, one day they will demand our attention. And you know what happens? It always costs more time, more money, more resources, more energy, right? So when we are so busy rushing from one thing to the next, not paying attention to what's going on inside of us or around us, or, what's coming up in, ministry or business or things like that, things can all of a sudden feel like we're on the ground and we are completely out of balance. And so one of the things is looking at balance is ongoing shifts, and balance is making sure that these areas are getting what they need so they don't now kind of throw everything off.
Yes, I love that. It brings so much clarity to think that balance doesn't have to be this equal, both sides, perfect all the time mentality, and that it can be more circular and more movement. Movement is what balance is. It's an action. I appreciate that so much, to look at it as a verb rather than a noun. That's solid. Very good. So I want to shift a little bit and talk about how following through on what we say matters is often easier than done. And you've kind of alluded to this already, but how do we build consistency? That's the issue, I think, for so many of us. We might have a good day where we feel like, today was a good day. I loved my family well. I loved God well, and I served well. And, this was a good day. But then other days it's like, oh boy, I was all over the place today. I got distracted, or I didn't follow through, or we had mistakes, or we had interruptions. And so how can we work to build more consistency?
First of all, not letting go of the standard of perfection, which I know you talk about as well when it comes to how we're approaching prayer and how we're doing things. We think it has to look a certain way. And if it doesn't, it's like an all or nothing. right? Like
Yeah.
it's a black and white. And I like to say, you know what, could it just be a both and? So maybe there
Yes.
are some days where,
Uh,
yes, things got a little bit more leaning one direction or another. But I think the first step is letting go of that perfection. But here's the thing with consistency, just like we talked about in the balance area, right? Those top priorities, those 8 areas I listed off, they need consistent attention in order for them to stay growing and balanced and all of
right.
that, right? And I think that it's almost like we approach every day like it's something new. We approach every week like it's something new. And yet there are the same baseline things that need to be happening in our marriage, that need to be happening in our parenting or in our business or in our ministry, right? So if we want to build consistency, we're pulling back and saying, what are some of the baseline things that these areas need? And how can I build that into the flow of my week? So it may not get my attention today. So, for example, like yesterday, there were a lot of different things going on. And so my husband and I did not get much time to connect. But guess what? Tonight is date night. And so I know we're going to have that, we have that time set aside to be together, right? So it may not get our attention every day, but when I know that it's built into the flow of my week, then it's okay on some of those other days. So really taking what are those areas that we say matter and not just hoping for the best or hoping we find time, right? But intentionally saying, okay, and where is this going to live in my week such that I don't feel guilty on Monday, when I'm focusing on my podcast or I'm focusing on a meeting or something like that, because I know this thing has a set time for it, at another place in the week. And I truly
Hmm.
believe so many of us, how many of us live off a to-do list, right? Or we live off post-it notes of to-do lists, or we have to-do lists of to-do lists. And, I think we're always making a list. I truly believe like 90% of what we do is repeatable. It may not be every day. Maybe it's weekly, maybe it's monthly, maybe it's seasonally, maybe it's annually. But one of the things I help women do is say, instead of trying to hold it all in your head or on all those post-it notes everywhere, let's take those things that you do want to be consistent with that are repeatable, things you are doing on some kind of a recurring basis. And let's create a routine, around them or
Yeah.
a workflow around them if it's related to business or ministry such that it is consistently getting your attention without taking up all your bandwidth. And it's built
Right.
into the flow of what you do when you sit down to work or how you take care of your home or the time you spend with your family. And then it's not just the randomness of what I happen to remember that day and get to. And then, oh no, I look at all the balls that I dropped. Ask me how I
Right.
am. Right.
Yeah. I have a book that I really, really love on building routines and habits. And it's not a spiritual book, but it's called Atomic Habits
Mhm.
by James Cleary. I just appreciate how we can do what you just said. We can build routines. We can establish habit stacking where we tie one activity to another activity to another activity where it becomes a consistent sequence in our lives. But that requires purpose. It requires what you just said, where you take a step back and look at how do I want this to look? How should it be built? And I think we get overwhelmed when we look at the big, big picture. And so, how would you encourage women to just start small? Say
Mm.
yes intentionally with your commitments, but start small. Start with just one thing, or, how would you encourage them to just be able to build what you're saying in our time, but really approach it in a very manageable way?
Yes, yes. Well, what you've alluded to is the difference that I talk about living by design and living by default. So many of us are living by default. It's reactionary all day
Mm,
long. It's tyranny of the urgent, right? And maybe it even feels like we're being really productive because we're always busy doing something. And yet we probably are feeling really frustrated. We're probably feeling very overwhelmed. We're probably feeling like we are dropping balls and things like that. And so I always like to say, like, again, pull back and look at, is this working, right? What would it look like to live by design, where I'm intentional ahead of time? We talk about decision fatigue. It is a real thing. We make so many decisions in a day. What if I could
mm,
make those decisions when I'm not in the moment? Such that I'm not caving in for ice cream and cereal for dinner because that's just how I feel in the moment. I've already, planned what that is. But to your question about how do we make it small? I think we pick one of those areas that we want to start with.
mm.
took something out of the planner that's just coming out, and it's called the balance assessment. And it helps you to look at those 8 areas, not in a judgmental way, but just in a let me notice where things are at. And then I encourage women, once they do the assessment, to pick one area. What's
Mm,
one area, right? That if I give some time, some focused time, maybe it doesn't need more time, maybe it just needs more of you when you give it time, right?
right.
And then just what's something small I can do? Or what would be that consistency thing in this area that would help to kind of start laying that foundation so it doesn't feel like it's always rocking the boat, and start with just one area, right? But always keeping the bigger picture in mind, because they do all interact with each other, and we want to have that bigger picture about where we're going. So it's not just getting through the day. It's who am I becoming? What has God called me to do? And that helps us to guide how we use the minutes and the hours as they build up
Mm.
days and weeks and months and years.
Awesome. So, so good. So, so good. So, when you mentioned this balance sheet, is this available for our audience to grab? And can
Yeah.
you tell us where? Because I think we're starting to conclude this conversation. It's been so great. I feel like we could just keep going forever because there's so many questions. This is an important topic to me. And I know that God has given us the time to do what He's called us to do. It's a matter of us equipping ourselves to be able to walk through, organize, approach it with clarity from Him. And I think that's what you do for so many of us. You really usher in clarity. So this tool that you've talked about, could you explain it once more to make sure that everyone is getting it, and that if they're interested in this, where they should go to get it?
Yes. So it's called the Redeem Her Time Balance Assessment, because until you know where you are, it's really hard to focus on where should my time be going. We're just going to
Right.
keep responding to what I call the shuns, the obligations, the expectations, the interruptions, and the distractions. And then
Mm-hmm.
wonder why we feel out of balance or why we're off in left field when we wanted to go right, right? So this
Right.
is going to help you just do what most people won't do, and that is to stop the busyness and take a few minutes to look at your time and to look at where you are. I call that the ROI on your time, right?
Mm,
Where we are today is a result of how we've approached time up until now. Good, bad, or
right.
indifferent, right? Just look at it neutrally, like you're almost a newspaper reporter. Okay, I'm noticing right after the assessment, this is an area that might be needing a little bit of attention, right? And the beautiful thing is we can make choices then with our time moving forward.
Yes.
So, yes, you can find that at redeemhertime.com/assessment. And I even put together a coaching video to walk you through step by step. Because I think sometimes we fall into judging ourselves and we look at that balance wheel and we're seeing how out of balance we are, and we want to, take it all on at once. And so that's why I walk you through step by step and help you with the mindset around it, as well. And, one of the things I want to point people to as well is just what does scripture say, right? Second
Yes.
Corinthians 9:8 is one of my favorite passages when I think about time. It's specifically talking about our resources, and he was talking about people being generous with their money, but I think it relates to time as well. And he says, and God is able to bless you abundantly so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. And what's so interesting, the people he was speaking to on paper, it didn't look like they had much money. And yet he was like, God is abundant. And it goes on to say, he is the supplier and the multiplier. It will
Yeah.
increase the store of your seed and enlarge the harvest. And so as we
Mm.
think about our time, God lays 24 hours in front of each and every one of us every single day. He continues to do that. And don't you know that he is the one who will produce a 30, 60, 100-fold harvest when we are planting that in the right soil and when we are trusting him with that process? Like
Mm.
with God, the ROI in our time is always abundant. And that's not because we're running around being the productivity bunny. It's because we've leaned into what I've coined as purposivity. I'm
Yeah.
partnering with God because there's a purpose behind the time he's given me. And ultimately, it is so that he gets glorified, not just so I can check off my checklist, right? But
Yes.
it's going to start with knowing, right, where we are, which is where that assessment comes in.
Yes, I love that so much. And for everyone who's listening, we will put that link in the show notes so that you can just click right over, whether you're on your phone listening on Apple, Spotify, wherever, or if you are on my site listening to the podcast, you'll be able to just click over and check that out. Lissa, thank you so much for being here today. I believe you have so much to offer all of us in the way of managing our time with honoring God and honoring our families, our businesses, the responsibilities that He's given us. Thank you for your call to bring us to purpose. And I appreciate you so much being here today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And if I can just sum it all up in 3 words, you have time. And when we start believing that, and that there's purpose behind that time, it starts shifting what things look like in our life, in our business, in our ministry, in our relationships.
So good. Everyone, thank you so much for listening in today. I know that this episode is a blessing to you as it has been to me. And until next time, God sees you and knows your need. Thanks for joining me on the Untangling Prayer podcast. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who could use a little hope. And be sure to subscribe for more. Until next time, keep seeking, keep trusting, and keep praying.
Hey friend, I'm Brooke McLaughlin, host of the Everyday Prayers podcast, a ministry of million praying moms. And I'm here to invite you to partner with God for the hearts of your children on the daily. Our goal at Everyday Prayers is to help moms understand and pray God's word. Join us each weekday as we share insights from God's word for today's Christian mom. Tune in to the Everyday Prayers podcast in your favorite app or by visiting lifeaudio.com.